The rent-to-rent strategy is all the rage right now. But if you're a property owner and you're thinking of letting your property to a rent-to-rent operator, you can really come unstuck. And in this video, I'm going to share with you 10 pitfalls that you need to have a plan to mitigate against in order to make sure you don't lose your shirt by renting your property to a bad rent-to-rent operator. But first, if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. We release new content each and every week. It's all dedicated to helping you be a more successful entrepreneur. And also like and comment, it really helps us out on YouTube. My name is Ranjan. I've been renting property out for 30 years now. And yes, I have given properties out to rent-to-rent operators. I've had some successes. I've had one failure, but that I managed to get out of that very okay because I abided by these 10 guidelines that I'm going to share with you in this video to make sure you don't become unstuck with a rogue rent-to-rent operator. Now, what's inspired this video is a little post I saw up on Facebook from someone who has really come unstuck. And just take a look at this. Looks like the company I rent my house to might be going bankrupt. They're not answering calls, they owe me money, they're overdue filing their accounts. I've instructed my local solicitor at £200 an hour, and they say it's going to take months to get the property empty because there are 5 individual tenants. They all have to undergo sort of individual repossession proceedings, and the total solicitor costs are going to cost upwards of 10 grand. Plus, if the rent-to-rent operator goes bankrupt, I'm going to lose thousands of unpaid rent and all of that. And even if I get a high court judgment against the operator, he's gone bust, so there's nothing I can do. Looks like it's going to be a horrible and expensive few months for me. Well, this is a very common and unfortunate story of people who give their property up to a rent-to-rent operator and later come unstuck. And here we're going to come do 10 key points that you've got to really consider to make sure you don't come unstuck. Number 1, how is your rent-to-rent operator funding the initial refurbishment? So you've been approached by a rent-to-rent operator. They're saying to you, hey, we'll take your property off you for 5 years. We'll give you a guaranteed rent every month. You don't have to do anything. We'll give you a rent payment each and every month. You just sit back and enjoy. We'll do all the work. That's great. How are they making their money? Well, they're making their money because they're taking the property off you as a whole property, and they're usually subletting it as individual rooms. Now, to make it suitable for subletting as individual rooms, there's usually some conversion works that are required, or refurbishment works that are required. And these works are more involved, if you like, and more costly if an HMO license is required. Do remember that if you've got 4 or more occupants, you need licensing everywhere, and there are some areas where you need licensing no matter what you do. And these will be for things like fire doors and all the rest of it. And it's usually the rent-to-rent operator who pays that costs. The question I have is, where are they getting their money from to do these refurbs? If a rent-to-rent operator has taken a lot of properties on from landlords over the last 12 months, where is their funding coming from? Generally speaking, as a rough rule of thumb, if you're going to get a license on an HMO and you're going to do the various conversion works required, refurbishment works required before you can let it, whatever cash flow you make from your first year of your rent-to-rent deal is going to be sucked up in doing those initial works. So what you want to know as the end landlord is where they're getting that money from. All too often they're getting the money by taking it off the deposits. They're using the deposit money they get from tenants, and that can be a worry if it's not properly protected. So you've got to be looking at where they're getting their money from to do that initial refurb. Now, rent-to-rent is often proposed as a strategy on training courses and the like for people who don't have any money to get into property. If they had the money to get into property and they had the money to fund the initial refurb of a rent-to-rent property, then why aren't they going forward with an asset owning strategy? That would make far more sense to people. So if you're renting your property out to a rent-to-rent property, rent-to-rent operator, you've got to take some interest in where they're getting the funds from to do the initial refurbishment. Do they have it in the bank, or are they planning to get it from the tenant's deposits? Number two, the rent-to-rent operator must put tenants' deposits in a custodial scheme. This leads straight on from point number one, really. When your rent-to-rent operator is dealing with the end tenant, the end occupiers, make sure categorically that all tenants' deposits are not held by the operator but are held in a custodial scheme like the tenancy deposit scheme, and make sure you see those tenancy deposit certificates. It can avoid a lot of problems if the operator goes belly up later on. Number three, reference your rent-to-rent operator as you would do any other tenant. Now, it amazes me how experienced landlords know all about referencing tenants, but will not do the same referencing and due diligence on a rent-to-rent operator. Do the same, if not more, actually more, because the rent-to-rent operator is proposing to take the property from you for 5 years, not 6 months. So you've got to do a lot more due diligence. Make sure, number one, that the rent-to-rent operator is a member of an ombudsman scheme. That is a requirement under the law. Make sure you go and see rent-to-rent properties that they've taken on from other landlords in the last year. See what they're like, see how they're run. Also ask to speak to those other landlords to take a verbal reference of some kind from them. Do your due diligence. Be very, very wary of a rent-to-rent operator for whom your property is their first one. You're liable to get into a ton of trouble. Number four, take a deposit from your rent-to-rent operator as you would do any other tenant. Again, I mentioned this in point three. It amazes me that people don't treat their rent-to-rent operator as they would do any other tenant. Of course, you take reference, as I mentioned before. You also take a deposit. Take 1 month's deposit that you hold. If everything goes Pete Tong, you will need it, because it's going to take you time to march in and take the agreement over. If there are problems at the end of the tenancy to do with the property not being handed back, you will need it. If you don't take a deposit, you will be at a loss at some point, usually at the time when the property is handed back to you. It's a must. Number five, use a commercial agreement with your rent-to-rent operator. Definitely not an AST. In fact, you can't use an AST, it just won't be valid. It has to be a commercial agreement, and a key clause to have in there is where the operator has opted out of their right to tenure, so that at the end of the lease, there is no hesitation, no doubt that you will get the property back. Listen guys, don't accept a rent-to-rent commercial agreement from your rent-to-rent operator. Ideally, I mean, when I've done this, I've drafted them. My solicitor has drafted them. If you're going to accept a rent-to-rent agreement from the operator, make sure you employ a solicitor to check it out from your point of view. Very important. If you don't do that, you're just going to get a one-sided agreement and you're going to sign up to some things that you're not that happy with. Now, a couple of clauses I've always made sure I include in these commercial agreements is what I call a marching in clause. So if there's any breach of the agreement or of statutory regulations such as HMO licensing, or more importantly rent, your rent is not paid for 7 days past its due date, then you basically exercise the marching in clause, which allows you to go into the property and assume the rights of the landlord as far as all the individual ASTs with the individual occupants. That's very, very important. Now that's very, very important for a number of reasons, and I mentioned in the introduction, I've done rent-to-rents. I had one occasion where it didn't go well. Remember, a 5-year agreement, a rent-to-rent agreement with an operator is a very, very long time, and you may have done all your due diligence in the beginning, but life has a way of throwing all sorts of uncertainties into people's lives. So in my rent-to-rent arrangement that went wrong, went wrong after the year one. After year one, everything was fine. The guy went through a divorce, and then he decided to go off to Thailand, basically, and shack up with his new missus. And he tried to leave it in a real mess, taking away people's rents and all the rest of it. Now, the thing is, the marching in clause allowed us to say, well, okay, the rent was not paid for 7 days from the guaranteed rent operator. We were able to march in and immediately assume the position of the landlord with all the tenants. We had already had 1 month's deposit from the rent-to-rent operator on our books. So we were able to kind of use that to compensate for the 1 month's rent that the operator had gone off with to Thailand. And basically, we weren't in a losing position. And that was really because we had adopted the 10 points that we're talking about now. And that's the problem with a 5-year agreement. Things can be all great in the beginning, but life has a habit of throwing stuff up, and a change of circumstance can dramatically affect how a rent-to-rent operator actually chooses to comply with their end of the bargain. As well as the marching on clause, make sure you have something clearly stated about the maximum people who can occupy the entire building. Because remember, HMO licensing these days has limits on the number of people that can occupy a property without you, first of all, needing a license, and every license will have a limit on the number of people that can occupy. Remember, even if you have a rent-to-rent operator, the buck stops with the owner of the property. So have written into your master commercial agreement with the rent-to-rent operator the maximum number of people who are allowed to occupy the property, so that if that's a breach, then you can exercise your marching in rights if necessary. Number 6, insist that your rent-to-rent operator uses ASTs, assured short hold tenancy contracts, with the individual tenants they put in the property. This is absolutely important. Some people will have you believe you can use license agreements. This has been tested in court. Basically, the courts say if it quacks and looks like a duck, it's a duck. Doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it a horse if you like, but just because you're calling it a horse, if it quacks, it's a duck. There are quite clear rules on what makes a property which is let on an AST, and it is not possible to make a room in a house share into a license and get away with it if it ever goes to court. So make sure it's an AST. The other thing I'd make sure you do, and have this in your agreement, your commercial agreement with the operator, that whenever a tenant is put in the property, you get a copy of the signed AST, you get a copy of the signed tenancy deposit certificate, and you get a copy of all the documents that were issued to the tenant. So right to rent checks and all this sort of stuff. You need copies of all of that. Because if you ever need to exercise your marching in orders to kind of take over the property, you've got all the paperwork there to hand. Now, in my master agreement with the rent-to-rent operator, I normally insist that within 7 days of a new tenant being put in or a tenancy changeover, that you get all this information supplied to you in electronic form. Absolutely critical. Number 7, know the financial standing of the rent-to-rent operator who is guaranteeing the rent. Now, you are handing your property over to a rent-to-rent operator. They're doing all the work, they're handling all the tenants' issues, they're collecting the rents from the tenants, and they're just giving you one payment at the end of every month. Sounds great, but it's the word guaranteeing that I find a little bit strange. Who are they to guarantee anything? Usually, the person with the asset has much more financial standing than some rent-to-rent operator who doesn't have a bean. So on what basis are they underwriting this rent guarantee in the first place? So what's the rent-to-rent operator's trading history? Most of these rent-to-rent operators are doing it from a limited company to separate it from activities in their own name or other commercial interests. Is this a brand new startup company? What trading history does it have? What accounts has it filed? What reserves does it have? A brand new company can be started very, very simply, and it also can be shut down and closed down very, very easily as well. Renting your property out to a brand new startup company, which has just been started by someone who's done a rent-to-rent course last week, is basically not that safe and will put you under a huge amount of risk. Number 8, ensure your rent-to-rent operator has an HMO license if one is required. Remember, I've said this before in many videos and in this one, it's the owner of the property that carries the ultimate risk and liability and responsibility for ensuring the property is properly licensed and that it has an HMO license, not the operator. The buck always stops with you. If it's licensable, make sure they get one. If it's not licensable, for example, it may have under 4 properties, make sure that your operator doesn't do anything to make it licensable inadvertently. The classic thing that can happen is that you have 4 rooms in a property, your rent-to-rent operator tells you you don't need a license, but they go along and put couples, 2 people, into a couple of the big rooms. And then you suddenly have 6 people in the property. Then you need a license. The license requirement is not by number of rooms, it's by number of occupants. And that's something where the the rent-to-rent operator is doing that to make more money, to make more cash flow, but they're not carrying the risk of non-compliance with the legislation, which is all down to you as the asset owner. Number 9, ensure your rent-to-rent operator has the staff to deal with admin and maintenance. A huge risk is dealing with someone who's just a one-man band. If they're a one-man band, what happens to managing this rent-to-rent empire when they're on holiday? Who deals with tenant queries, the leaky tap, the boiler not working and all the rest of it? Rent-to-rent needs boots on the ground. And to make sure that you're not going to have a headache up front, you need to check out, well, what staff does your rent-to-rent operator have and what process and mechanisms do they have for managing rental properties. The most successful rent-to-rent operators that I've come across, that I've dealt with, have already got their own portfolios. They've already got their own portfolio of property themselves, and they've already got management teams and maintenance teams in place for their own properties. And they add rent-to-rent as a sort of bolt-on, if you like, to their existing property management and property maintenance capability. A one-man band who's just been on a course, who's started up a brand new company, who's doing it all himself, does not have the bandwidth to look after, maintain and deal with the admin issues of a whole bunch of rent-to-rent rooms. Number 10, make sure you get the property back at the end of your rent-to-rent agreement. Now this is the one area that practically no one considers when they give their property to a rent-to-rent operator on a 5-year agreement. How do you get the thing back? Well, one of the issues that happens is it's coinciding all the individual tenancies in your property to end on the same day. Let's say your lease will end with the operator 15th of May 2025. If a room has become vacant in April, they can't re-let it because obviously a tenancy has to be for a minimum of 6 months. So what happens with the rent-to-rent operator in many cases is that they lose interest in the dying days of the agreement unless they know it's being renewed. And the reason they lose a lot of interest and it can come unstuck is because they end up with more voids at the end because it's very, very hard to coincide all their subtenants to have their tenancies ending at exact the same time. You also find that there can be a huge amount of maintenance to do when you get the property handed back. Rent-to-rent works from the operator's point of view if they spend the minimum they have to spend on maintenance and upkeep, and that is usually bodge and fix type of maintenance. That you can do for so long, but at the end of a 5-year period, what you tend to find is when the property is handed back, there is a huge amount of maintenance work to do, and it is not to the same standard that you let it out in. Most rent-to-rent agreements end earlier than a 5-year term, usually because the rent-to-rent operator particularly if they're a new operator, realise it's not worthwhile and they cannot afford to see the contract through its 5th year. So remember, most of these type of rent-to-rent agreements do end with a huge amount of uncertainty at the end. It usually involves the operator walking away from the deal because of inability to make subtenants' end dates coincide, and the fact that they're worried about the refurbishment to hand it back in the state that they got it in. They often just walk away from it. So the end is very, very messy, and hence, again, the importance of having the marching in clause in your commercial arrangement with the operator in the first place to allow you to nip these problems in the bud and not allow them to swallow up a lot of time and money and anguish from your point of view. To summarize, if you're planning to rent your property out to a rent-to-rent operator and they haven't been in business for at least 3 years, you can't see stable accounts on company's house, and they don't have at least 10 rent-to-rent properties on their books already, which they've been managing for more than a couple of years, then it's unlikely to end well. If they're not an established player and they're just taking on their first 1 or 2 properties, they're a one-man band, it's a brand new company, and you're their first 1 or 2, your property is one of their first, then it's unlikely to make it to the end of the 5-year contract, and it's very likely to end in tears. So ensure yourself by making sure you follow all the 10 points that I've given in this video. Now, the rent-to-rent strategy is actually very popular in the commercial property space, and it was somehow ported over to the residential space. It works a treat in the commercial space because of the, it's basically everything is a commercial arrangement with commercial property, and there's less regulation on the tenancies, which can get people unstuck. A lot of rent-to-rent courses these days for residential properties, they will give you examples of WeWork and Regis as being classic players of the rent-to-rent strategy. And that's true, but those are for commercial properties. Renting out, if you're a Regis and you're renting an office block from a commercial landlord and then subletting it as individual suites, that is a completely different proposition and not comparable to doing rent-to-rent in the residential space, period. Now, I do a lot of commercial property investing. I run some courses on commercial property investment and management and getting into it and building a successful commercial property portfolio. If you want to find out more about those and want to book yourself a place, then you can find the details at bakerstreetworkshop.com. Full agenda, dates, all the info you need if you want to further your knowledge there. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you had any rent-to-rent disasters, let us know in the comments below. If you agree or disagree with what I've said, please let us know as well. Let us know also in the comments anything you want us to make a video on, and join you guys again in the next video. Bye for now. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you're not a subscriber, what are you waiting for? Subscribe, hit the bell icon. As soon as we upload, we'll let you know. And enjoy these. They're all dedicated to helping you be more successful in property. Happy investing!